Hey guys, Sam here at NA Studios. Today I've got a bit of a big one for you. I wanted to show you a full mix rundown of how I'm processing absolutely everything in my mix with my plugins of choice. But I thought what would be even better is to show you how I'm doing that compared to how someone else is working completely differently than I am. So I want to introduce you to Lee. Now, Lee is a mix engineer who I've known for years, and he is well known for creating a punchy, upfront sound. He's got a number of charting credits to his name, far more than I have. He works exclusively in Pro Tools. That's his door of choice. That's what he's used for a lot of years. And he loves Waves plugins. These are his go-to tools every day for mixing, for mastering, for whatever it is. Which brings me on to the second point. He's using these tools, but he's using them with his ears. He is making the decisions. He is making the choices in his mix based on his own knowledge and experience. The tools that he's using are merely the step that he's using to get these sounds. The plugins that he's using largely come second to his own ability to hear and process stuff and work out exactly what it is he needs to do. So he's going to be using Pro Tools and Waves, and I am going to be using Logic Pro. It's what I've used for a number of years. I really like it. I think it's fantastic. And I'm a big fan of Slate Digital plugins. I use these plugins every day and I like them. I think they work well. And again, importantly, this is how I'm using my ears and how I'm processing stuff, how I'm getting from A to B, how I am processing some audio information through my ears and then working out where it needs to go using these plugins. And in this comparison, the main takeaway is that yes, we're using different tools. Yes, we're using different processes, different kinds of bussing, different techniques to get there. But ultimately, it comes down to what we're hearing. Ultimately, it comes down to us both working on exactly the same mix in a different DAW with different tools in a different room. But all those things are kind of secondary to what we're hearing and how we are thinking, this is how I'm going to process this piece of audio. So sit back, relax. First of all, Lee is going to take you through his master bus process, and he favors the top-down approach. Check it out.
So the first thing to look at is going to be the mix bus. Let's see what assistance I've got from this. First of all, what we're going to do is we're going to listen to a before and after. The first thing we've got on here is the J37 tape from the Abbey Road bundle. So here we are in bypass. Let's bring it in. And off. And off. So I think what we're adding here is possibly a subtle bit of widening. There is definitely some niceness going on the top end. I've actually used a preset by the looks of things, mastering fat, tight and open. If that's what it's selling, then quite frankly, I'm buying. So I think we've probably got a little bit of added compression in there, a bit of saturation, as I say, and it just makes things kind of sound a little bit more together right off the bat. Next up, we've got the CLA Mixdown. This one is quite new to me. Let's check it out in bypass and bring it in. Engage. And on. And on. Okay, so on the face of it, this is quite a simple plugin. 4 controls with kind of, don't know, a little bit nondescript in terms of their function. We've got bass, treble, glue, and drive. You can see I'm a fan of the drive. I'm frying that up quite nicely. Let's bring in each of these individually and see what they're adding. So the first one we'll engage is the bass. So things start to get a little bit rounder and fatter in the low end. Next, let's add the treble. Starts to add a little bit of clarity in there. I think it's definitely doing something in the kind of the upper mids. I think that much is obvious. Next, let's add some glue. Not sure how we're measuring this. Possibly stickiness. I don't know. Looks like we've got a couple of different flavours of glue there, probably Uhu and Bostik. But essentially what we're doing is it looks like we're adding some compression to this. You can hear the transients just kind of sit down in the track a little bit, and it makes everything kind of sound a little bit more together. Next, let's fry it up with some drive. So you can hear the transients are starting to get a little bit crunchy. It just sounds nice. It kind of gives you the vibe of probably mixing on a large format console. So after that, we've got a little bit of EQ. This is a gimme, this one, courtesy of FabFilter Pro Q2. Now, this was an EQ that was added after the mix was done, and as you can see, I've just done a little bit of sweetening across the whole frequency spectrum. Let's bring it in, see what it's doing. So yeah, just made some minor cuts here and there. I mean, I've taken out stuff like this. Not pleasant. So got rid of some harshness, got rid of some kind of woolliness in the low end. So that concludes that one. Next up, we've got an L2, and now I promise I'm not doing any compression with this one. I've literally just got the ceiling down a bit. I think this was just to catch any clips, of which there aren't any, but let's have a listen anyway, just to prove that it's not doing anything. No attenuation going on there. I am a man of my word. So that's my mix bus. Very, very simple. Not a lot going on. As I say, I mixed into it. I haven't added all this afterwards looking for a quick fix. All I've done is applied it at the start, and sounds great.
Now, Lee's master bus chain is quite vastly different to mine. His saturation is getting from that one CLA plugin, and then he's using EQ to make some quite surgical dips, some cuts. I've chosen to do that at the kind of mix stage, and then I'm using my master bus to just improve the sound overall. Let's take a look at what we've got going on here. So first off, I've got an instance of Virtual Tape Machine. Love this plugin. It's doing an awful lot to the sound without doing too much, if you know what I mean. Then I've got a gain plugin so that when I come into Virtual Mix Rack, I'm not saturating too much, and my saturation is happening here. I've got Virtual Mix Bus, and this is going on the Neve setting. Love this plugin. And then I'm going into the Virtual Tube Collection on New York, and then I'm going to Bomber, and Bomber is adding some real tone shaping and some harmonic stuff. Love that plugin so much. Then I'm going into Infinity EQ, which is adding some overall low end, some overall top end, and some mid-side stuff, which we'll come on to. And then after that, I'm going into FGX, which is just a great master bus processor overall. Let's take a listen to this without any of that processing, and then with, and we'll discuss the differences. So pretty massive difference there. A lot of that is coming from the tape machine. A lot of that is coming from the saturation. But let's just take a listen to what each element is doing. If I take them all off, you'll notice that SonarWorks and then a reference plugin here, they're my kind of cheat plugins that I'm using, but they're not actually processing the sound here. So I'm going to forget about those. First off then is Virtual Tape Machine. This is the one that I'm doing a similar thing to Lee with. He's using that kind of top-down approach where he's going into his master bus at all times. I'm only doing that with this one plugin. I like it. I like what it does to the sound. It kind of adds that room around it and squashes everything together. Let's hear it without, and then let's hear it with. What if this was So I'm not red lighting it, it's going into the red a touch, but that red light importantly is not coming on, so I'm not actually clipping anything, distorting anything. It's just a gentle overall kind of hugging of the sound. It's really in that bottom end. This plugin has the half-inch 2-track setting, and that's exactly what I'm using. I love that for a master. I'm not too concerned about the tape type or anything like that, but this is kind of my go-to setting, and this works for me. After that, I've got a gain plugin, as I said, which is just bringing down the level as I come into my virtual mix rack. This is where a lot of my saturation is actually happening. Let's take a listen without this and then with it, and this is a big, big difference. So what that's doing is Virtual Mix Bus is adding that level of kind of bottom end using the Neve setting on the Brit N, and then my Virtual Tube collection is adding some saturation, it's adding some overall coloration, but mainly I'm getting this sound from Bomber. This is adding some harmonic stuff, this is adding some, it's kind of EQing it as well, it's adding a little bit in the high mids and it's adding a bit of bite, but it's adding that dynamic punch as well. Just take a listen without this on and you're going to hear what a massive difference it makes. It's on the fat setting, but it's just got this aggression to it. It's just got this kind of presence which it adds, and I absolutely love that. I wouldn't have a master bus without Bomber on it. And you can bring up the intensity. I've got it just over 50. You can make it less intrusive, more intrusive, whatever you want. For me, that worked well there. And then the Infinity EQ, this is doing a lot here. I'm adding quite a considerable boost in the top end and a gentle-ish boost in the bottom end, a pretty meaty boost in that kind of 100 hertz area, just adding to the overall weight of everything. But then crucially, I'm adding some mid EQ here. We can put Infinity EQ into mid-side mode, which is another reason why I love this EQ on my master bus. And I've got it at just under 2 kilohertz. This is adding a bit of breathiness into the vocal and a little bit of bite into the snare. I could have put this on a channel level on my vocal and my snare. I chose not to. This was kind of an afterthought, and I thought I was missing something in that kind of region. Put it on Infinity EQ on the master bus, and it really sang. It's subtle, but what I wanted it to do, it does extremely well. Just listen to the breathiness of the vocal when I bring this channel on. Just that breathiness of the vocal. I can't really think of a better way of explaining it. And then it's a little bit of a bite of the snare as well. Overall, doing this to the master bus means that it's affecting everything and kind of making that EQ move to everything at the same time, which means that it's just adding to that sort of element of homogeny. It worked well for me. I like it. And then finally, we've got FGX. So this is just the all-in-one master bus processor. Just take a listen to what it's doing. It's adding just another dimension to it. So that's across the spectrum. It's adding some low end with the low punch here. The detail and dynamic perception is adding to the dynamic impact of the overall track. It's adding a bit to the brightness as well, I feel. And then the compressor, it's not even hitting 1 dB of compression, but it's just notching down the transients on the snare and the vocal just a touch, just enough to kind of hug that sound. I really like the compressor on here. It can be very gentle or it can be aggressive. Just take a listen to it without the compressor and then with, and you'll hear exactly what it's doing. Just clamping everything down, but in a really nice, gentle way. It's not being too aggressive. I've got the attack at relatively slow, release relatively fast. I'm only at 1.5 to 1 ratio, and it's just notching things down just a touch. I really like this FGX master bus processor. It's got the compressor in it, it's got your overall transient and dynamic detailing, and then it's got the meters on it as well. I'm not doing anything too squashy here. I'm not adding a load of level. It's just shaping the sound nicely for me. And to me, Slate Digital and my master bus, those kind of 4 varieties of plugins are doing all the heavy lifting, and they're doing exactly what I need. So check out now how Lee is crafting his drum mix. He has got some really interesting EQ moves here and some fantastic compression techniques. Check it out.
So here is my drum kit. Let's pick an appropriate section of the song. In fact, I think the riff loop will do for this one, and check out the drums in isolation. Let's remove all of the processing I've applied. So we've got some pretty slamming drums there. Let's check out what we've done. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove all of the plugins on the individual channels, and we'll have a look at what's going on the drum buses. So let's bring those in and out so we can assess how much difference we're making. So this is with the drum bus engaged. And we'll just remove that reverb. Let's bypass. And the drum bus back in. So we're doing quite a bit of shaping on the drum bus. I usually think of the drums as the whole box that the rest of the mix kind of fits into. So the amount of top end you've got on the overheads, amount of low end on your kick is going to have, you know, some kind of influence on how bright the rest of the instruments are within the mix. And I also think the EQ on the snare is going to play a big part on like your overall mid-range shape as well. So I tend to do a lot of work on the drum bus because it saves me having to do too much work on the individual channels. And I think generally what you're left with is a kit that kind of sounds a bit more cohesive, a bit more coherent, and you're not, you know, having to wrap around probably, well, I don't know, 16 dB of 8K on the snare top or something like that to get any kind of clarity and brightness out of it. Let's have a look at what we've done in order. Let's remove everything, and here we are. So I should mention that what's going on, we've got this drum bus, all the drums are feeding this one. That is then running in series straight into this drum mix bus. So no real parallel processing going on this one. First up, we've got the Scheps 73, a nice Neve 1073 emulation. Let's see what it's adding. So very subtle, a little bit of top end, removing some 1.6K just to clear out the mid-range a little bit. We're adding some 35 shelf, but we're also high passing at 50. So effectively what we've got is a boost from kind of 50 onwards. Next up, we've got the SSL EV2 channel. This is the most recent SSL 4K emulation they've done. Let's have a look, see what it's doing. And bring it in. So the only thing we're doing is getting rid of this. It's that boxy, honky, cardboardy rubbish. It just, I don't know. No one wants that in their drum mix. It sounds dreadful. Just get rid of it. Get rid of it. Next up, a little bit of compression with a CLA 2A. Usually I would have probably used a slightly different compressor for this, but I wanted something, you know, probably a little bit more transparent, not quite as quick to react. Let's have a look at what it's doing. Bring it in. It's doing some nice things to that snare. And without. And bring it in. Next up in the chain, we've got another bit of J37 tape. Let's engage it, see what it's doing. Again, no shame, I've used a preset here. Mastering, high frequency smoothing, round bottom. Ooh, misses. So yeah, you can definitely hear we get an extension of the top end, which is rather nice, and I think it just kind of warms up the low end a little bit. There's going to be a little bit of saturation going on there as well, but generally, again, a subtle change. After that, we've got a little bit more corrective. Well, I say a little bit more, we've got a bit more corrective this time. So let's have a look at what this EQ is doing. So we're adding some top end, just a pinch, about 6K. Removing this. Again, clacky awfulness. And then we're removing some of that sort of tubby, water tanky, oil barrel-y kind of nonsense in there. We don't need it. And then lastly, we're adding a little bit of sub, around about 56 Hertz, just a pinch, 1.5 dBs worth. No compression going on here. However, we do move on to a compressor next. And this is the Abbey Road RS124. I think it's an Altec piece of gear. Let's bring it in. Definitely giving me a bit more extension in the top. It's adding some brightness, and I think one thing to note is that the mix control is set to just over 50%. So effectively we are running this in like a parallel compression kind of mode. After that, we've got a bit more EQ with the Waves F6. This one does have the ability of being run in dynamic mode as well. So let's see if we're using that. So yeah, it looks like we're just kind of tickling this band here. Let's have a listen to see what we're taking out. It's the kind of stuff that just makes your ear bleed. So what we're doing is manipulating this band dynamically. So when we get an abundance of that awfulness, what we're doing, this EQ, is essentially just helping dip it out a little bit. Next up in the chain is my wild card. We have some oak sound, you have to excuse me, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, Soothe 2. I'm using a preset here called Cymbal Smooth. Let's bypass and then bring it in. You can see what it's doing is it's just dialing in on very, very specific sort of resonances and harshness in the sort of mid to upper mids of the drum mix. Just helps to remove some of that fatiguing stuff that's going on in there. Next up, we've got a C1 gate. Nothing to say about that. Some of the compressors I've got running on the drums, like the RS124, do add a little bit of noise, so this is just to kill that off. Other than that, not affecting the drum mix in any way. Next up, let's have a look at some individual channels. So we'll start with the kick drum. This is all 3 kick mics. Let's bring in the processing. And out. And let's have a look at them individually just to see what's going on. First up, we've got the kick in mic. Quite a lot of top end on this. First thing we did is just smooth out that top end with a little bit of J37 tape again. So let's bring it in. So you can hear there's definitely a lot of saturation going on here. It's just killing those spiky, peaky transients. Next up, Scheps 73. Let's bring it in. So even though I worked quite hard to remove some of the top end with tape saturation, I've added it back in. Sometimes things don't have to make sense. So I've added some 12K, we've added a little bit more point at 4.8 and just a crack more low end on there as well. Again, we're also high passing at 50. Next up, we've got a bit of classic compression with the CLA 76 in blackface mode here. Let's bring it in. It's giving the kick drum almost kind of a flappy kind of sound. I think it sounds pretty good. We're using a fast attack, fast release, 4:1, and about between 3 and 5 dB of gain reduction. So nothing groundbreaking or earth shattering going on there. Next, let's check out the kick out mic. So here it is. And we're adding some SSL EV2 channel to this. Let's bring it in. What are we doing? We are removing, again, boxy, you know, just, it's got no place in the drum. We don't need it. Let's get rid. adding a little bit of knock from the drum around about 1.5k. I've been a little bit kind of subtle with that. I didn't want to bring out too much of that nasty stuff on, like, you know, the bleed. Other than that, a little bit of compression, 5:1 ratio, not particularly fast or slow release time, doing, you know, up to probably about 6 dB of gain reduction. Next up, we've got the kick sub channel. Let's check it out. Let's bring this in. We're removing, stuff that's kind of centered around the snare in this mic. And then we're doing a little bit of compression, very similar to what we had on the kick out mic. Similar kind of settings, 5:1 ratio, not particularly fast or slow. Just kissing it, just a little bit. After that, we've got a Waves F6 again. Let's bring it in. So what I'm doing is I'm taking away some of the real low stuff down at 45. Didn't really feel like it was particularly useful in the mix. Just kind of all it was going to do was essentially destroy people's speakers. We don't want that. And lastly, again, just a little bit of that kind of knocky sound. Getting rid of that. We don't need that in the kick sub mic. All the drums together. And there's my kick drum. Simple. You can see I've tended to favour the kick sub mic over the other ones in this. I think that's because there was just so much top end on the kick in. I haven't really needed to get any clarity from anywhere else. So I've been able to use a bit more sub. Next up, seems like everybody's favourite, is the snare top. So let's check out what we're doing. Here it is in bypass. Obviously this is being affected by the processing on the drum buses and on the mix bus. First up, we've got the Scheps 73. Let's bring it in. So adding some fatness, adding some mid-range, and adding a little bit of top. I've also got a high pass at about 80 Hz. So I'd have manipulated this EQ when the mix, when all of the instruments in the mix were playing. I did very, very little work on the individual elements of this mix in solo. So typically you wouldn't find anybody ramping on 1.6k on a snare, but in the context of the mix, I think it really worked. Next up, F6. Bring it in. Adding a little bit of top. And we're removing just a bit of boxiness. Not too much boxiness removal there. I don't want the snare to be too scooped, because then that has the potential to affect kind of the mid-range character of the rest of the instruments in the mix. Next up, here it is, some 1176. Why wouldn't you use 1176 on the snare? It's there, use it. I've got the blue stripe version here. It just tends to sound a little bit more smashy and grabby than the blackface version. I think it works a little bit better on drums. Let's have a listen to it. Bring it in. And out. And in. So about 5 dB of gain reduction, fast attack, fast release, 4:1 ratio. You know, I'm not absolutely nuking it or annihilating it or anything like that. It is just, you know, just controlling it a little bit and giving the snare a little bit more sustain. Next up, I want a bit more low end, so I've actually used a Waves Max bass for this. 2 X's, of course. We know that more X's is better. So let's have a listen. And bring it in. Just fattens up the snare a little bit, you know, by adding kind of sort of harmonics and things like that. It does probably slightly more voodoo stuff than an EQ would, and that way I think it probably ends up being probably slightly more transparent. So I wanted to add low end to the snare and a bit of girth and fatness, but without sort of obviously boosting up an EQ. With all that being said, though, on my next F6, let's bring it in. I've done exactly that by boosting up a load of 229 Hz. That was starting to give me some weird resonances, so I've just dipped those out with some very, very narrow cues here. Let's just check them out. And then lastly, we've done a bit of a cut at 6.7K. Let's see what I'm taking out. Too much of that, it's just going to take your head off. We don't want our heads taken off. So that basically concludes the snare top. Let's bring in the snare bottom. Doing a little bit less to this. First up, Scheps 73. Let's take it out of bypass. Adding a bit of top end. Just removing some 1.6 and a little bit of extra body down at 110. That is it. Following that, we've got the CLA 76 again. Let's bring it in. So, not quite as rapid on the attack and release times. Amount of gain reduction. Yeah, maybe up to probably about 3 dB of gain reduction. All I wanted to do was, kind of allow the snare strainers to have a bit more sustain. Let's listen to the snare drum on its own, both mics. Here we go. And now I think would be a good time to talk about the drum reverb, so let's bring it in. For this, I am using CLA Epic, and I'm using a preset again, no shame, called Medium Snare. This particular preset looks like it's just using the reverb side of this plugin. So let's listen to the snare, and then let's bring in the send. Quite subtle at the minute, but what I've done is I've actually compressed the reverb return with another CLA 76. So let's bring that in and then see what that does to the snare. And engage. Okay, so clearly we are now in a cave, or a canyon, or a tunnel, something like that. Anyway, I think what we can determine is that it is quite a vast amount of reverb, but I'm not worried. In the track, it's kind of sitting nicely, and not only that, all of the other instruments in the mix are going to be eaten into that ambience as we go along, so I think you can sometimes get away with using a little bit more than you would probably think you need. Next up, we've got some hi-hat. Let's find an area in the song where it is doing something. So what do we say about the hi-hat? Not a lot. I've done nothing to it. It's a hi-hat. The image of the hat is quite good in the overheads. All I've done is pan it to the opposite side to which it's featured in the overheads. This is to kind of spread the top end energy across both speakers, stops it kind of getting a little bit too fatiguing in one ear. So let's move on to the toms. I think what we'll do is we'll take all of these as one. Let's find a fill. So here we are. This is sans processing. So we've got the same snare reverb engaged on these. Let's bring in the processing. So a little brighter, a little bit more focused. And then let's check out what we're doing. So I believe that the EQ on all of the toms is largely similar, if not identical. We'll take the rack tom as the example. Let's put that on a little loop. That's not going to get annoying too quickly, is it? Right, let's take the plugin off. And bring it in. So we're adding some top end. Just a little bit of air at the top there, just for a little bit more attack. Not doing anything to the upper mids. We're removing again, sort of boxy. You know, we don't need it. I don't know. I'm probably going to say that quite a lot of times during this mix. We don't need it. We don't need that boxy rubbish. Other than that, no compression, and it doesn't look like any other filtering. I believe the floor tom is the same, so let's just bring that in again. The only outlier on the toms is we do have this sustained tom part in the intro. So I've used the same processing for the tom tracks that play through the rest of the song, but for the intro where we've got this sustained tom part, I've just altered the processing slightly, and I've added an F6 on here just to stop it getting too relentless. Let's have a listen in bypass, and let's bring this in. So a little bit more top end, because we don't have any other instruments really providing much top end in the intro section, and I've just, you know, shaped the low end a little bit just so it's not getting too woofy or boomy. That basically concludes the toms. Not a lot going on there. Next up, we've got the overheads. Let's have a listen. First up is the J37 tape. Let's bring it in. I've used the preset overheads 2 parentheses stereo. You know, I didn't want mono overheads on this one. So what we can say is that it seems to be probably enhancing the top end a little bit. It's probably adding a very, very small amount of saturation. The input control just here is dialed up a little bit. Other than that, I would say that there's definitely a little bit of compression going on there as well. After that, we've got a Scheps 73. Let's check it out. So no huge moves on this one. I'm not adding top end. All I'm doing is removing a bit of 4.8 to remove some harshness, and no low end moves, and just a high pass at 50 just to remove any rumble. After that, we've got a little bit of compression. Let's check that out. So what I'm attempting to do in this one is just basically catch the snare. I don't want the snare kind of, or at least the image of the snare in the overheads, I don't want that to kind of dictate too much how the overall snare sound in the track is, because it's just not going to be probably quite as pleasant as the direct snare mics. So we're doing a little bit of gain reduction. You know, just a dB, again, a fast release, not a particularly quick attack, an 8:1 ratio. So no great shakes there. Let's move on to the F6. Using this in dynamic mode here to take out a bit of this. Sort of tizzy, scratchy kind of stuff that we don't need. Other than that, I made a couple of cuts around about here. This is 2.5K or just under. Harshness zone, and then yeah, a bit more harshness, so we'll just dip those out to make our overhead sound a little bit sweeter. Next up, we've got the room track. First thing I did on this was bring the image in just a little bit. You can see I've got the pan control set to 45 apiece, and yes, of course, we've compressed it. I've used a preset here called Rock My Room. Let's see if this has indeed rocked my room. Here we are in bypass. Let's bring it in. It has rocked my room. The snare sounds something similar to a gunshot. Next up, we've got a trim plugin, and this is doing very little other than just flipping the phase. I found that I probably just preferred the sound of the snare with the phase on this room track flipped. The difference is only very, very minimal. Let's have a listen to the snares and the room, and then turn the trim on and off. It's, yeah, I don't know. I'm still undecided on that one. Honestly, I can't really determine which one sounds the best. When I listen to the kit as a whole, I did kind of think that, you know, having the phase flip just sounded a little bit better, so that's why it's there. Again, we're talking very, very fine margins here. Next up, a little bit of EQ with the SSL 4K channel. Let's check it out. Bring it in. So we've added some low-end welly, around about 56. That's kind of got like a nice thumpy, boomy kind of vibe going on. I've not done any more compression because we've got plenty of room rocking going on right at the beginning of the chain. And then the last thing, there it is again, that kind of cup your hands over the microphone kind of sound. We don't need it, it's rubbish, get rid of it, put it in the bin. After that, we've got a little bit of Waves F6 again. Let's check it out. Just clearing things up a little bit. Tend to use the character EQs for my broader boosts and, you know, some cuts as well. And then what I'll do is, once I've kind of got a bit of a flavour going on, I'll tend to go in with a surgical EQ such as this one, or, you know, you can use any surgical EQ for this. You could probably even use the stock one that comes with your DAW, and just pull out any offending things that are, you know, just kind of getting a little bit unpleasant to listen to. So there we are. Let's bring in the rest of the tubs and let's listen to them as a whole. So there's my drums. Simple.
Now, he says it's simple, but it's only simple because he knows through experience what to do and how to do it. He's getting a great sound out of a lot of those Waves plugins, and the F6 is featuring there, and the Neve style channel. There's some great stuff there from Waves, which I'm a big fan of. I kind of sit in the Slate Digital camp on the 2 because it's what I'm used to, and I'm going to show you how I'm processing my drums using those Slate plugins now. So starting on the kick then, I'm going to show you these 3 channels, and more specifically I'm going to show you why I'm not using one of these. To me, if I've got 3 channels on one instrument, the kick drum, then I really need to get something important from each of them. To me, this kick sub mic is giving me all that bottom end of the kick, which is half the battle for me. I want something giving me all the low end, and I want something giving me all the attack, whether that's all from one mic or from 2 channels or whatever it is. I feel like I'm getting that low end from this sub. Take a listen. And I'm boosting some low end here using just the channel EQ. So that sounded good to me. There's no reason for me to go into the Slate Digital stuff. Channel EQ is nice and easy to bring up in Logic, and it just works. And to get that attack then, I'm going for the kick in mic, and I've got a trigger set up. But importantly, just take a listen to this as it stands. Really attacky. So when you look at my processing chain for this, my EQ is not actually doing anything to the top end at all. And that's because I've chosen the right sound in the first place. So much of mixing is not doing what you think you should do, but doing what's needed. I thought I needed some aggression there, some attack, some top end. So instantly you would think, well, let's reach the EQ, let's add some top end. I didn't need it because I chose the sample right. I'm not even going to go into what sample it is. It's just a drum sample of a kick drum that sounds nice and attacky. And that worked for me. So with this processing, I've got everything going through the SSL E channel because it sounds cool. The processing on the EQ is just a little bit of bottom end, just in a slightly different place in the sub. And then these 2 compressors, you'll see when I show you here, they're only doing like a couple of dB each, just taking off that initial top end. Let's hear it before and after. All it's doing is adding a little bit more in that bottom end and just shaving off that peak just a touch. Because I've chosen the right sample, I don't need to do any more processing on there. So that combined with the sub mic gives me a great weighty kick drum sound. and it fits the track well. I didn't use that kick out mic. It's down so low that it's basically not being used. If I bring it up, it's got that kind of mid-rangey boxiness, which you'll see that Lee was kind of notching out that kind of area. So for me, I just didn't include it in the first place. To me, that made the most sense. So it's down low enough to not make any difference to the mix at all. So that's the kick out mic. It's not being used. Kick in mic, I've just got a sample straight away. I know what sound I want, so I've got it from the sample and doing relatively minimal processing. The kick sub, I'm just boosting a bit in that low end, and it's giving me that weight that I need. The snare drum is an interesting one EQ wise. So let's take a listen to the snare on its own. This is just the top mic. Now we've got lots of reverb, lots of processing going on there, which I'll come to in a second. But if we just mute all those buses for a second and just hear the snare top mic on its own. It sounds a bit lackluster. And to me, immediately, what I would normally do with that kind of channel, I would say, right, let's just get rid of it completely and put a sample on. But I want to do something here that I often kind of preach and say that you should do, but I have to force myself to do sometimes. And that is make decisions in the mix. Don't solo everything. Don't just listen to everything on its own, because that's not how it's going to sound in the mix. It sounded a little bit like that on its own, but once I brought it into the mix, I could kind of understand what it was actually adding. It's adding that realness to the drum. So if we bring all the processing back in on the virtual mix channel, you'll see exactly what I'm adding. And EQ wise, I'm not adding anything at all. Nada. Nothing on the EQ. We'll come on to that in a second. I'm adding a bit of revival, which is some thickness and some shimmer, which I think works absolute wonders on drums. You'll see this quite a lot through my drum kit. As before. It adds some point to the transient and then some overall weight. I love that. And then this compressor, it's not doing too much. It's just the attack. It's just adding that smack, that slap, which is what I love this FG Dynamics compressor for. It really adds the aggression and it gives you a great drum sound just with turning a few controls. I've just brought the threshold down until it's compressing a little bit. I've left the ratio and the release exactly where they were. It's just adding a bit of squashiness for me. So if I go onto my snare trigger track, this is just a sample from my Rock Snare Pack 1, not going to go too much into it. Just know that it was kind of a weighty sample that needed some of that bottom end, but then also some snap on it, which is kind of surrounding the mid-range that I'm getting from that microphone. So then when I bring in the mic track, so the trigger is bringing in the low end and the high end, and the microphone track is bringing up that mid-range, which together they work quite well. On the trigger track, I've got Virtual Mix Rack again, and again, no EQ happening. I've chosen the right sample and it's working here. I've gone for revival again because it's just bringing up the lows and highs, bringing up the overall smack and a bit of the high-end aggression there. But the compressor FG Stress, here it is before. So a couple of things you'll notice there. First of all, it's adding some overall weight to the sound. It's adding, again, some of that smack, which is what I love to get from snare samples. But you'll notice that it sounds quite unnatural. It's not a very dynamic part, and that is by design. I've made it so that Trigger 2, Slate Audio in this instance, is not actually triggering the very quiet samples. I've brought the threshold up so that it's only triggering the hard, the medium, and kind of the mid-hard samples. And as I say, that's by design because I wasn't getting too much of that from the actual snare mic track. I'm getting it from the bottom snare, but that's just the rattle. So I needed some of those ghost notes to be brought up. And in the mix, that's really benefiting. So speaking of that snare bottom, I've done something interesting here. Let's take a listen to it without any of this processing, and then you're going to hear what it's doing. I'm killing that transient completely. It's just bringing up the rattle, the kind of after effects of the drum. I don't want any of that attack. To me, it didn't add anything, but I did want the sizzle of the snares afterwards. So that compressor is just completely slamming down, fast attack, threshold, quite a considerable amount down, and then it's just allowing the release to come through. So it's clamping down on that transient, and then the release is coming up afterwards. That's what I want from a snare bottom mic. I don't want any of the attack, I just want the sustain, the release on it. So all those drums together. So we've discussed where that kind of impact, that low end is coming from, but as you can see, we've not added too much in the high end. We've added those revival plugins, but they're not really accounting for all that high end that we're hearing. That is all coming from the room track. So I just want to play the room track on its own. This is with whatever drums are going into it, and you're going to hear exactly what it's adding. It's adding some airiness, it's adding some space. This is with Verbsuite Classics, but importantly, it's EQing the sound essentially. It's adding all that top end into it. If we just take a look at the plugin, I'm using the BM7, the Precacity kind of emulation, and then a bright chamber, relatively long, 1.5 seconds, but I'm boosting a load of mids and a load of highs on this EQ. And this is kind of EQing the overall sound. It's EQing the ambience as opposed to the straight up sound. When I'm EQing a snare drum, I don't want to be getting all that, the hi-hat spill and all that kind of stuff. So EQing things individually, you have to deal with gates, whatever, can't bother with it. So if you want to add just some overall high end, then you can do that on the bus, which we'll come over to in a moment. But if you're adding a load of reverb, you can EQ the reverb as well. And that's just going to add a nice airiness to the overall drum room sound, which is what I've done here. And I think it's been really effective. Let's take a listen to the entire drum mix with and without this reverb and just hear what this room channel is doing. It's adding some airiness, it's just adding some overall life, some overall vibe. I think that is a big part of the drum sound. And with that, I've got then going into a compressor, which is not doing too much. It's just bringing down the transients a little bit, just kind of squashing the sound, just bringing up the overall sound of the room. Let's hear it before and after. You can hear those tails happening there, and that's quite integral to what's going on. But overall, that room channel is just bringing up the overall top end, the overall bite, the overall airiness of the drum kit. I think that's super effective. The toms in this track are kind of few and far between, but let's hear a section where they are in. Let's hear them on their own without any processing, and then let's hear what we've done to them. It's a night and day difference. Before that processing, they sounded lifeless, they sounded naff, and with Virtual Mix Rack, there's a great preset in there actually that comes up for the rack tom. It's literally just called rack tom, and this is always my starting point. I always start off with this, and then on the floor tom, I go to the floor tom preset, which you can see here, and tweak from there. You'll see these two are extremely similar. On the EQ overall, it's generally doing the same stuff. The EQ points are kind of a little bit different in places. The compression is kind of similar. Revival is similar. But on the floor tom, I've gone for this earth. So this is the Air EQ earth, which is kind of a harmonic thing. And it's saying, well, there's not too much low end there, but EQ is not really cutting it. So let's generate some more low end. Let's kind of synthesize some of that low end. Let's hear exactly what that's doing. Just listen to the floor tom when I take this out and then bring it back in. It's a great way of adding some bottom end that you don't already have when EQ isn't quite cutting it. It's a really interesting plugin. If I were to just solo just the floor tom channel, I'm essentially just saying, okay, around 50 hertz, I want you to cut at that point, but then I want you to boost at that point as well. So cutting everything below it and then boosting that area as well. And that's done, the steepness is generated by this. So if I bring this all the way down, then it's basically no boost happening whatsoever. As I bring it up, then the boost is happening more around that resonant frequency. And I kind of settled on that midway point there. You can go absolutely crazy with this. It's a fantastic plugin for adding that bottom end. With a floor tom, it works wonders. I didn't feel like the rack tom really needed it, but should it have needed it, that's another great plugin you can use for getting some extra bottom end out of your toms. The compressors on these two are just shaving off a touch. You'll see on the rack channel, not doing too much. Just bringing down a little bit of the initial peak of the drum hit. But overall, my drum sound is predominantly a bit of EQ from FGS, and then this revival again is adding a load of that bottom, a load of top, which just helps it punch through the mix. Take a listen without any of that processing, and then with in the mix, and you can hear a vast difference. Kind of didn't really hear them too much. And then they poke out. It's not just a volume thing, it's an overall tone thing. We're saying, right, this is the part of the frequency spectrum I want, let's give it a load more, and that works. The hats are just completely off. I didn't feel like I needed them. I was getting them from the room channel and the overhead channel. So the overhead channel now then, I've got a small amount of EQ happening here, and this is with the custom series lift, which is a very, very gentle EQ. It's barely even audible when you're actually doing it, but take it away and you miss it. Just comes down, just adds a little bit of extra sparkle, a little bit of extra something, and it helps with the cymbals, it helps with the toms, with the snare. Overall, it just really works well on a full overhead mix. So such small amounts of processing actually happening here. I'm doing a lot of it from the buses, from that room reverb bus, and then from the overall drum bus, which we'll come on to in a second. But I've also got some rooms here, which you'll see I'm not actually processing other than putting them through the room bus. I've got a gain plugin on every single channel on this mix, not just drums. That's the one that I automate. I don't like to automate faders. I don't like to lose control of my faders because that's kind of counterproductive to me. So I put a gain plugin after any processing on every channel, and that does my boosts, my cuts. Anything that I need to change volume-wise for automation in the mix, the gain plugin is going to be doing that for me. So I've got a drum squash here, which is compressing the hell out of it. Let's take a listen. Real nasty. And bringing that up just adds a whole extra dimension to the drum kit. It adds to the sustain, it adds to the roominess of it. But I'm using a different EQ here. This is the FGN. I've got a video comparing all the Slate Digital EQs. I'll put it down in the description. And you'll see how vastly different a lot of these EQs are. The FGN is a bit more precise, a little bit more aggressive, shall we say. And it's just, for me in this instance, I actually want to get rid of some of the cymbals. So I'm taking out some about 4 dB at around, 3.5 kilohertz. That's taking out some of the harshness of the cymbals that's being added by the compressor. And then I'm adding some high end afterwards, just a touch, to kind of move those cymbals, the high frequency content of them, taking out some of the mids, adding in some of the highs. So in relative terms, you're kind of shifting that. And you can hear what that monster's doing. It's just, it slams it. But if you listen without that, just the drums on their own, without that smash, and then bring it in, it adds to the toms, it adds to just absolutely everything. It's just a nice element, a nice little level to bring up. And then one that if you've been watching my videos before, you'll know I have on every drum mix. This is Drum Bomb, and I'm cutting out some of the low end up at 60 hertz, and then just adding in a little bit of bite and a little bit of harmonic, dynamic, whatever it is that Bomber does, it does it really well. And just soloing that channel, you'll hear it on the kick and snare. It's just adding that extra layer underneath. Let's go to a section where we're really going to hear this. Let's go to a chorus, and you're going to hear exactly what this is doing. If I take Drum Bomb out and then bring it back in, it's the overall dynamics of the kick and snare, and indeed anything that you put into it. It's great on vocal buses, great on mixed buses, as you've seen, guitar buses, whatever it is. It just adds an extra dimension of attack, weightiness, whatever you want to call it. I love it. It's great. The only other thing to talk about on drums here, other than the main bus, is reverb. I've just got the snare going to this, and it's old familiar. It's a preset, bright CLA snare, and it just sounds good. I don't know what else you want me to say about it. It just sounds great. It's slightly more mid-rangey than the room sound because I've added all that extra high end, but it works. It just adds some space, and it's brilliant. Now, an interesting one here is on the actual mix bus. I've got a virtual mix rack, just adding a little bit of high end, just a bit of 3.5 dB at 12K, just adding some lift to the cymbals. But the real processing on the drums here is coming from these guys. So I've got the virtual bus compressor rack. The first one is the FG Grey, so this the SSL kind of style one. I'm using that. I'm not using the Focusrite, the FG Red, and then I am using the FGMU, but not for compression. Let's take a listen to this FGMU and hear what it's doing, or more accurately, what compression it isn't doing, but how it's EQing. So this is with it off, and then we'll bring it in. Just adds that lift in the mid-range, in kind of the high mids, the high frequencies. I don't really like this too much as a compressor for actual drum mix, but I do love the overall tonality, the overall brightness that it adds, and that along with the reverb is really adding so much to the overall brightness of that drum mix. And then the actual compression is happening from this FG Grey. You'll see that I've got the threshold just down, so it's just clipping off a few of the transients. The ratio is just at 3:1, so it's not going crazy. Relatively slow attack, medium release, but then the HPF, the high pass filter on the side chain, is not compressing the low end below 105 Hertz. If it were, it would be killing my kick drum, and maybe my toms as well. But it's not, it's just attacking the cymbals, the snare drum, and anything above that 100 Hertz area. Take a listen to it without this compressor and then with, and you'll hear how it's just squashing, how it's just gelling everything together. And because I'm clipping off some of those transients, I've just added a bit of makeup gain there, just 3 dB. So that's my drums. Nothing crazy there. EQ wise, I'm not doing a whole lot. A lot of the top end is coming from that reverb, as I said, in that room channel. And that was another dimension for me. Once I realized you could do that, it was like, well, why am I actually EQing stuff individually as much as I am? Why not do it on a bus level? So I guess that kind of speaks to Lee's whole top down approach, but I'm just not really realizing I'm doing it, but doing it on an effects bus kind of achieves the same thing. So next up, you've got Lee's guitars, and he is doing some really interesting stuff here. Check it out.
First of all, let's have a listen to this pair we've got going on in the chorus. Just remove all the processing. Whoa, we got some mid-range. So the guitar sound for this track, I believe, was a Marshall JCM 800 boosted with a tube screamer. One of the other pairs we've got going on in the riff section, I think we switched out the tube screamer for a MXR 108 Classic Fuzz, I believe. Okay, so let's see what we're doing. Very, very simple on here, no massive moves. The first thing that we encounter is a Scheps 73. I tend to use this EQ for the broader moves, and then if I need to get a little bit more surgical, I'll then grab the SSL, and then if I need to be, go right down to a macro level, then it'll be a case of, digging out a surgical EQ like the F6, or the one that comes bundled with your DAW, or in this case, when I was cheating a little bit, the FabFilter Pro Q2. Right, let's engage the Scheps 73 and see what is going on. Let's bring it in. Yes, there we are. Right, so what we're doing is we're adding some top end, a little bit. Removing some 1.6, let's bring that back in. Not pleasant, let's dip it out. We are high passing at 160 Hertz, and are we adding any low end? 0.1 of a dB. I think that boost has possibly been where I've just knocked the control a little bit. I don't think anybody is hearing a 0.1 dB difference. Right, after that we move swiftly on to an SSL channel again. So this kind of supports the point that I made just a minute or two ago. Let's bring it in and see what we're doing. So one of the things I haven't done with this EQ is I haven't actually added any brightness. Yeah, it does sound like, the guitars are getting brighter. There is a little bit of compression going on, so it's going to give us, probably a slight increase in level. But generally, I've made cuts here. So let's have a listen to what they are. Again, getting rid of some box. And getting rid of a little bit more box. Just a little bit down. Just a little bit lower in the frequency range. Other than that, like I say, just a subtle amount of compression. We're doing some filtering. We've got a low pass filter at 9K and a high pass filter at 55. So it just kills any unwanted rumble. And that processing has been applied to all of the guitars. And last up, we've got a little bit of surgical corrective with the Waves F6 again. So let's listen to it. Bring it in. Subtle change. You can see we're using band 6 here in dynamic mode. If we kind of get a little peaky on here, this is just kind of bring it down for us a little bit. Other than that, we made a dip in the mids. Bit of boxiness, got rid. And we're bumping up to 117. Just for a bit of thickness, what I want the guitar to do is kind of meet where the bass kind of leaves off. Same with the top end, I kind of want that to be, kind of meeting the overhead, so it doesn't sound like we've got a real big disconnect between the top end of the kit and the top end of the guitars. The only other thing I've done to these is we've got a quad-tracked set of guitars in the middle 8. They sound a little bit like this. These are the fuzzy ones. Now you can hear these are a little tubby in the low mids. So what I've done is I've used an F6 and just very, very simply just taken a little bit of it out. Let's just have a listen to one individually so we can check it out. So here's the guitar on its own. This is what I'm removing. Yeah, bit woolly down there. Let's get rid of it. Plus the fact we've got another pair of guitars added in on top. So all 4 of those together sound a little bit like this. And then bring the mix in. Rhythm guitars. Simple, innit? Next, let's have a look at the lead guitars, melody guitars, feature guitars, weird guitars, noisy guitars, all the guitars. You want guitars? We got guitars. Right. So I think the best thing to do would be to examine them in order of appearance. Let's firstly check out the guitar that we've got in the intro and in the verse. This is what it sounds like. So this is a nice guitar sound anyway, didn't really feel the need to do a great deal to it. Let's bring in the guitar bus, which is a J37 tape. It's only going to have a very, very subtle effect on here. We're just adding just the smallest amount of saturation and then whatever colour we get from the different tape formulas and IPS speeds just here. So that's it. Yeah, pretty simple. So what else we've done, the first thing we've done is added some 1073 with the Scheps 73. Let's bring it in. Now I've thinned this out quite drastically. What I didn't want is any of that kind of mid-range interfering with anything else that's going on. The piano's quite dominant in this section. I felt like having this guitar kind of with too much mid-range on it was just kind of going to clash with the piano and just create something that was going to get a bit muddy. So I've thinned it right out. I've taken all of the 360 out of it. Let's just bring that back in. So that's what I've removed. Add a little bit of brightness up top with some 12K. Next, one we haven't seen yet. This is the Reel ADT, and this again is from the Abbey Road bundle. Let's bring it in, see what it's doing. So what I'm doing with this is adding some prettiness. This is It's really nice. It just adds some sort of subtle flanging, chorusy kind of lushness. And yeah, nothing else to be said about it really. I've used the default setting. This is just how the plugin instantiates. I thought I just wanted a little bit more flavour, a little bit more spice and seasoning on this guitar, so I've used this and it's worked out quite nicely. The other thing I've done is add a little bit of reverb. This is from the CLA Epic plugin that we used on the drums, most notably the snare. Let's bring it in. Now that is a nice, washy, chilled, ethereal kind of... It's just nice. It's nice. You can hear it. It's nice. It sounds good. One of the things I've used this reverb for is I didn't really want this guitar to be too focused on the left-hand side of the mix. So I've added the reverb in there, and let's see, have I panned it? Yeah, I've panned it hard right, so it's kind of focused a little bit more on the right-hand side of the mix. Stops the guitar sounding too mono, and sounds great. After that guitar, we come to the lead guitar in the chorus. And it sounds like this. For all of the guitars from here on out, we're going to leave the guitar bus engaged. So here's the lead guitar in the chorus. We've added some EQ. No surprises to see the Scheps 73 being utilised here. Let's bring it in. So again, just thinned it out a little bit, taken some mids out, added some top, and just scooped out a little bit of the sort of 220 and down, high pass at 160, simple. Similarly, with what we had going on the verse guitar, we've also added some effects to this. This is courtesy of a Waves H delay. I've got a dotted quarter note set up here. Let's engage it. So one of the problems I encountered with this guitar was that it was one track. I didn't really know where to put it. I didn't want it straight up the middle because it was going to interfere with the vocal, and it's usually best to not interfere with the singer. And then I kind of thought, well, I don't really want it just stuck on one side. It's going to kind of kill my, my balance a little bit. I didn't really have anything comparable with, the same amount of top end energy to put on the other side of the mix. So I thought, right, what I'll do is I'll use a delay. I'll pan it over to the other side, and hopefully it should kind of spread this out and give us two guitars for essentially the price of one. Let's have a listen to the chorus. I've muted the chorus vocals, and let's have a listen to this guitar part. And bring it in. So there you go. It's just given me a little bit of imaging on this, and yeah, two guitars for the price of one. Not that one costs a great deal, but there we are. It's just a little problem that you can use a trick like that to get round should you ever encounter it. That's basically it. You can see, again, bit of a pattern emerging here. Not huge amounts of processing. All I've done is some EQ to shape things how I want them, and then I've just added some effects. Most of the other tracks in this session, with the exception of the snare and the toms and a little bit of vocals, are quite dry. So what it's allowed me to do is be a little bit more liberal with the effects on the lead guitars, and it just sits them out of the mix a little bit more. Just makes more of a feature of them and kind of gives them a little bit more gravitas and importance.
Now, whereas Lee has kept a lot of his drums relatively dry effects-wise, and he's moved those effects onto the space that's being left by those so the guitars can take them up, I've kind of taken a bit of a different approach. Now, Lee is a guitarist, and I play guitar, but I'm more of a drummer, I would say. So we've taken different approaches to these with our sort of instruments of choice. Let's take a look at the guitars here, and you'll see how I've not really done an enormous amount in terms of individual processing. Let's just check it out. So the guitar bus then, let's take a listen to this on its own. You can see there from the mix window that any of these guitar channels, from this one here all the way over to here, The only actual plugins that I've got on those are EQ plugins, which are either taking out some low end, taking out some high end, or notching out some general nasty frequencies. So I'm going to speak about the guitars as a whole, because that kind of makes sense, rather than going through each individual one saying, I've done nothing to this one, I've done nothing to this one. So first off then, if we just look at our EQs, I've got some high end on this one and just some overall kind of low end taken out. But the bus is where it actually all happens. This is where I've got some overall lift, some overall low-end punch, and then some grit coming from the API. If we just take all these plugins off for a moment, then we're going to bring them in one by one and just see what it's doing. Remember, I'm not doing a whole lot to these guitars. To me, I'm using these plugins, these Slate Digital plugins, and I'm using them only when I feel I need to. It was recorded really well. So in this kind of instance, you're not necessarily going to need to do too much carving out, too much shaping. You're just adding to what's already there. So let's take a listen to this dry, and then we'll bring in the console. Just a subtle level of kind of oomph. It just brings everything up just a small amount. I don't use this in the same way as we're kind of told that we should. We're told that we should put virtual tape machine on every channel and have it going into the master bus. I don't do that. And we're told that we should use virtual channel on every channel and then have that going into their relative buses. Again, I don't do that. I just kind of use what sounds good to me at the time. And to me, I didn't need to do that on all those channels. I just needed to do that on the guitar bus. So going to our custom series lift then, this is doing a fair amount in the bottom end. It's doing quite a lot of brightening. You'll hear it's got kind of some rumble going on there, some nastiness in the bottom end, which, because I've EQ'd these in context, I've not even noticed that at all. If I'd gone in and EQ'd the guitars on their own as I'm listening to them now, I would have got rid of that. But it didn't actually pay to do that in the context of the full mix. Didn't make the slightest bit of difference, so I've not bothered doing it. That's added a lot in the bottom end and a lot in the kind of presence area, maybe at that sort of 4-5K area. And then I've boosted a bit more in the very highs, a bit more in that 4K area as well, using the FGA. This is a great EQ for guitars. I really like this. It's got a lot of bite to it. Let's take a listen before and after. And this is like a sheet has just been lifted off the guitars. And that's really important for me. It's just helping them to actually punch through the mix. If we take a listen to the guitars in the context of the mix without that FGA engaged, they just sound dead. And then bring it in and you hear everything happen. They're just poking through there and they're just sitting around the vocal in a very interesting way, which I'm going to come on to in just a moment. But this guitar here, which is the verse guitar, sounds very nice, is going to guitar reverb with Verbsuite Classics. Digital plate. So what I was going for here was that, you know, the Boss, the black reverb pedals, I've always kind of liked that. I've not thought of it as a real reverb sound. It's more of an effect. It's like a shimmery kind of reverb effect. And that's the sort of thing I wanted here. So that's exactly what I've gone for. I've brought up again some of the mids and the highs and taken out some of the lows in the same way as I did with the drum reverb. And it just adds this airiness to that already kind of ethereal guitar sound. Just adding a little bit of sustain. Nothing too crazy, nothing too out of this world. It's just adding a little bit there and just adding a bit of length to those, what I would call prangs, those guitar prangs that you have in verses. It sounds good to me. And then that in turn is going into the guitar delay, which is the Slate THU, the amp simulator collection. And it's another, what I'm assuming is kind of based off the delay pedal, the Boss one. And it's just adding a very, very small amount. It's barely even coming out in the mix. Hear it on its own. It's just like an echo. And hear that with the actual guitar. it's just blending into the sustain. It's not actually acting as a delay in itself. It's just adding to the overall decay of the guitar and just adding a little bit of extra oomph in that sustain and just meaning that it lasts just that little bit longer. Now, I set up a guitar room channel here, which I typically send a load of guitars to. I've not ended up using it. I don't feel like they needed much more space. And because I've done so little on the guitars, I feel like we should talk about what I've done on an instrument bus here, because this is something quite interesting. So instruments over here, right at the end, I've got MOTT on this. And what's actually happening is all the instruments are going to this bus, except for the vocals. The vocals aren't going into this bus. They are instead going into the side chain, and that's just the lead vocal. And this MOTT plugin is compressing just the high end on the instrument bus, everything except the vocal, when that vocal is present. And that's just creating a little bit of room for that vocal. I've done so little to those guitars. I've literally just done it on the bus channels with a couple of exceptions, a couple of bit of brightening, a little bit of taking away the low end. So that's all I've done on the guitars. They sounded so good as they were. I didn't need to add too much to them, didn't need to take too much away. But this is where the heavy lifting of the actual mix, crafting those EQ curves in together is actually happening. Just watch this plugin and just see what's actually happening when the vocal comes in. So little actually happening, but it's just creating a little bit of room for that vocal to come out in the high mids and the high end. I've got some clipping going on here on the inputs and outputs. It didn't really matter. It didn't make much difference to the mix as a whole. So I'm just taking a look at this. I've got the amount up to 100% because it's not actually doing too much, so I don't need to kind of rein it back. Just take a listen without it and then with it and just hear how it's just taking off a little bit of that high mid, high end information off the instruments when the vocal comes in. It's just dulling the mix slightly around the vocal so that the vocal has space to come through. You don't even hear it happening. It's just such a small amount, but it really benefits the vocal and allows that voice to poke through the mix, and it does wonders. Next up, let's take a look at Lee's bass guitar.
Here you join me again in Pro Tools. So let's have a listen to the bass. Got a couple of different playing styles. We've got this muted pick in the verse, which is just here. And then we've got the swung sustained notes in the chorus. And then more sustained notes in the post-chorus. Let's remove the processing. And then let's check out what we've done. So first up, a little bit of J37 tape. Let's bring it in. I've used a preset here called MHB Bass. I think this is a Michael Brower preset. I'll be honest, I'm not hearing a great deal of difference. So it does leave me questioning a little bit why I've used it. However, you know, even if it's making a small difference that I can't really hear, if it's an improvement, it's an improvement. Next up, we move to the bass aux. This is just running in series, so we can continue the processing chain here. This is the Scheps 73. Let's bring it in. So what I've done with this one is I've tried to recenter the pick attack on the bass. I've removed quite a bit of 3.2K. And then I've added a dollop of 12K, which kind of seems a little bit counterintuitive on the bass, but let's dial this back and have a listen to what it sounds like without it. Let's bring it back up. So we're getting the pick attack back, but it's just centering it in a different place, and I think that's a bit more pleasant just there. Other than that, we're adding some shelf at 35, but again, we're high passing at 50, so essentially what we're doing is we've got like a big boost at 50, and then we're cutting everything below that. Next up, we've got a little bit of compression with the Abbey Road TG 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I don't know, all the numbers, stick all the numbers on it. And what we're doing with this, like I say, with a bit of compression, let's have a listen. Let's pick a different bass part for this. And let's bring it in. So we're adding a little bit of drive, a little bit of fatness. And the mix control is at 50%, so again we're doing some parallel compression on the bass. We're also adding some level. Next up, we've got some Waves F6 again. Let's bring it in and see what it's doing. So one of the things that I noticed when listening elsewhere is we had a bit of an abundance of this. It's that kind of woofy frequency that makes most systems you play or mix through kind of sound a bit cheap, even though they may not be. It just kind of does that whole kind of like, kind of, you know, that horrible kind of just resonant guff. You know, don't need it. Get rid of it. And don't get me wrong, I'm not getting rid of all of it, because, you know, we do need some of that warmth in there, but just not too much. I tend to try to focus my bass, you know, kind of slightly lower than that. So to counteract the cut we've made there, I've just given it a little bump at 64 as well, and that's just kind of smoothing the trough there. So as we go into the trough, we've got a nice little lift, and then we're down into the depths of the trough there at 187-ish, seeing as I just moved it. Other than that, that's all we've done. The other bass track we've got going on here is a carbon copy of the bass track we just heard. The only difference is that I've cut out some sections of it and I've EQ'd them slightly differently. In this riff, I kind of found like some of the notes kind of got a little bit boomy and a little bit iffy, so I've got the same tape, they're being bussed to the same place, which is this bass aux. And then the only thing I've done is added a little bit of extra EQ, and I've just removed some 124 Hertz just to prevent a little bit of kind of low end build-up. So here's without. So it's a little bit rumbly. Let's bring in the F6. And that's just tidied that up nicely. So there we have it. Very, very simple. No great shakes, no huge moves. There's your bass.
Now, you'll notice that often at the ends of these sections, Lee and I are both kind of saying, there we go, not much to it, that's just the way it is. Which is maybe being a little bit minimalist about what we've actually done. But just to emphasize again, it's so much about what you're hearing and how you're not just sticking on something that you think should sound right, but actually listening to what does sound right. Slate Digital or Waves or UAD, Softsuite, whatever it is that you're using, it's always the case that you're listening first and then making the moves second. Taking note of what needs to be changed and then changing it with the tools that you have at your disposal. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the bass on my mix, which kind of goes against the rules that I've just said. But let's take a look. So let's take a listen to the bass that's happening all the way through the mix. Pretty dirty. That's the kind of chorus sound, and in the rest of the verses as well. You'll notice that this isn't actually happening first off. In the initial section, I've got a different bass, which is, I think it was like the scratch bass that they did, but I really liked it. So it sounds like this. Lots cleaner. But let's go and take a look at the main bass first off, and this is what's going on throughout the chorus. And this is, first of all, going through the rig player. So this is in THU Slate, and this is kind of the rig stuff that's similar to a Kemper, I suppose, if I can say that. It's a profiler, and it's taking the sound of an actual amp. You'll notice, though, on the actual amp itself, it sounds to me like it's already got an amp sim on it, so it's not actually a DI. So technically, you shouldn't put it through another amp, but I did, because I thought it sounded good. It adds to that top end. And then that is going into my virtual mix rack again. I've got it going into the FGN, the Neve EQ, and that's just adding some bottom end. What I find about the Neve style EQs and the Neve style channels in the Slate Digital stuff, as opposed to the Slate or any of the other ones, is to have this beautiful bottom end, and it really does just create so much oomph in the mix, and it really is welcome. I'm taking down the input though, because that bottom end can get kind of distorted quite easily, and the distortion I want to come from something else, which we'll get onto in a second. I'm compressing pretty hard just to level stuff off, and I've not got any of the high pass filters or anything engaged because I want it to compress that low end. I want that to be there. But the bit that you're hearing that I'm sure you want to know about is the distorted track. That sounds like death on its own, but when you bring it in, it's just adding that extra layer, which actually in the mix it's adding so much definition to that bass guitar, and that's exactly what I needed, because I didn't feel like I was feeling the bass guitar, but I wasn't hearing it. I was aware of all that low end, but I couldn't really hear the pick attack, and that's what I wanted. So on this track then, I've taken out all the low end, specifically in this kind of area, which is where a lot of the actual fundamental stuff was, in the kind of higher notes, and then just taking out all the bottom end completely there. And then it's not your traditional distortion, it's going through a load of different distortions. Now, pay attention, because this is an interesting one. On the FGN here, I'm using this just as a dirt box. I've got the line going all the way up, and that's just distorting the hell out of it. Without it, nice. Which is then actually just adding a load of level going into the New York. So it's not necessarily that the FGN is adding all that distortion, it's not adding all that kind of clipping, it's just providing a load of level so that the next one in the chain can provide it. It's adding a bit of saturation on its own, I'm sure, but going into the next one, that's where all that distortion is coming from. And that is the New York in the Virtual Tube Collection. Take a listen without it. Just that buzz. And Bomber without it. Again, on the fat selector, not a preset, is it? The tone, whatever it's called. It's just on the fat setting, and it's adding a nice amount in that kind of mid-range, just the grit that's helping it punch through the mix. And then going into another FGN. This is such an aggressive EQ. I love it here. But I'm taking out quite a lot of the very high end, so the real pick attack, and just keeping in and adding a bit more of that mid-range around, what is it, 1.6, 1.7K. Without it, nice. So the reason that I'm doing this is far more important than what I'm actually doing. I'm kind of just scooting over exactly what I'm doing and trying to get onto why I'm doing it. I needed some more attack out of it. These are just the tools that I've used to get there. I wanted a bit of distortion, but I didn't want like distortion pedal kind of distortion. I wanted just something that was like saturated and just going to help it to poke out the mix just that little bit. I wanted just to sit as an extra layer on top of the bottom end of the bass, and I think that's exactly what it's achieved here. Then I'm bringing up the level with this one, so it's getting a bit more of a coloration, and then taking it down with trimmer. And that is basically all I've done for the bass. There's no bass bus or anything like that. It's all coming from just the normal standard channel going through that THU slate, and then that parallel channel on top, the real distorted stuff. The one that's going on in the verse, the actual clean sound, the one we heard earlier, this one, is not actually going through any processing whatsoever, which is crazy. It's not even being compressed, not being anything. But that just kind of worked. And I'll say it again, why you're doing something is far more important than what you're doing. Typically, if I have a bass guitar, I'm always going to slam a compressor on it, always going to slam an EQ on it. This didn't need it, and that the mix has benefited from that greatly, from that way of thinking. So Lee's going to take you through his piano, keyboard, strings, all that kind of stuff now. He's done some mad processing here. He's got really aggressive with stuff, but it works. And it just goes to show that he thought it needed that. And the proof is in the pudding. It needed it because it's been so beneficial to the mix. Check it out.
Here's the piano. Let's have a listen. Let's remove the processing. Ooh, now Now that is an abundance of low mid and just general congestion in there. Let's see what we've done to clear that out. The first thing to note is that the piano has been really nicely played, so let's engage what we've got going on. First up, a little bit of tape. Can't really hear what this one's doing too much. Preset is 811 on the formula and then at 15 IPS. Let's bypass. Okay, so it's adding a little bit of brightness and it just feels like it's cleaning up the low end just a smidge. Again, subtle improvement, but all the little improvements make up to one large one. Next up, we have a compressor. This is the Abbey Road RS124. No parallel compression this time. We're just flat out 100% on the mix. Let's bring it in and have a listen. So that's just controlling the transients a little bit. Piano's quite dynamic in this track, especially when we get to this section. You can hear that this compressor is holding this really nicely. It's working really transparently on this piano. It sounds really, really good. Next up, and then this is a drastic one, believe you me. Here is a Scheps 73. Bypass to begin with. And cover your ears. Let's bring it in. Ooh, now that is some brightness, I'm not going to lie. And you might be thinking, Lee, you madman, why have you got that much brightness on it? And I'd say, well, it actually works quite well in the track. So let's examine what's going on. Now, I've used the Scheps 73. It's got a really natty mid-side EQ mode on it, and that's what I'm using for this particular track. So in this mode, I should note that how we're monitoring at the minute is just stereo. So we're listening to both the mid and the sides. Let's switch over to the mid mode. Now, in this mode, the left-hand side of controls are controlling the sort of the mid section of the stereo image, and the right-hand side are controlling the sides. So in the mid section, let's listen to that. Let's bypass. So you can hear we're just listening to the mid portion. So we're adding a bit of brightness, we're dipping out some lows, and we're high passing at 160. So no groundbreaking moves there. When we move over to the sides, however, I mean, that brightness nearly takes your head off. Let's go to a slightly more loud and proud section in the chorus. So we're adding 12 dB of 12K. We're adding even more top with 4.8K. We're wrapping on 10 dB of that. We're killing some 220 out of this, and then we're high passing at 300. So we're really, really thinning this out. Let's bring in the mid channel to this again. That balances out a little bit, which is frankly good, because if it didn't, I mean, that would sound awful. Right, so that's kind of where we're at with the piano. The next thing I did was add a little bit of F6. Let's see what it's doing. So this is what I'm taking out. I'm using it in dynamic mode. Some nasty frequencies in there, and then band 3, that's what we're taking out in there. So essentially removing some of the sort of cheap sounding frequencies from the piano. Not that the piano was cheap, I believe it was a Nord stage of some description. So that basically caps off the dry piano sound. Now to season this ever so slightly, I've set up an aux here, and it is running into this, which is a C1 chorus / vibrato. I've got the mix set to 100. I've also synced it, I believe, to half notes, and that's it. Let's bring in the chorus so you can hear what it's doing. And then engage. Really, really nice. Let's see if we can just listen to the chorus on its own. Sounds really nice, just blended up underneath the piano like that. Let's take it out. Does some nice things to the stereo image on this one. So no additional reverb added or anything like that. We've got a severe amount of EQ, but in the track, let's have a listen. And in the verse section. Let's mute it. You can hear the mix kind of disappears once you mute that piano in there. Last time a bird sings, we are but sand. So it's adding probably a lot more than you think it is. Last up for the instruments in this song, we have a simple synth part, and this happens in the riff in the middle 8. Let's have a listen. So with the rest of the band in, it's adding kind of, adding a darker flavour to this riff. Let's check it out. Take it out. And in. It's a pretty cool part. In terms of EQ, this is what we're doing to it. Shocker, it's a Scheps 73 again, working in mid-side mode. We've used a similar principle on this as what we used on the piano. Let's just have a listen. So, loads and loads of low end on here. Let's bring in the EQ. We've thinned it out a bit. In the mid channel on this, we have done the following. Remove some 110, move some boxiness in the mids, done nothing to the top end, and we've high passed at 160. There's an awful lot of low end on this. So it's just tidied that up nicely. Let's check out the sides. So we've added a large amount of 12K, removed a little bit of 700, we've scooped out even more of the low end, and we've high passed even higher up. Both sources together, and no reverb, no additional effects or anything like that. In fact, maybe let's give it a little bit of reverb. Let's see what that sounds like. Adding a little bit of the same plate that we've got on the snare. And in the track. Okay, I quite like what that reverb's doing. Let's just make sure it doesn't kind of mess up the following section. No, the transition there still sounds about right. So let's leave the reverb on. Cool.
The moves that I've made for strings and piano have been far less intrusive than what Lee has done. And I'm not using the word intrusive as a detrimental word there. What I'm saying is I've decided to dig into it far less. And when I listen to the mixes back to back, I can hear how what he's done has actually improved the sound of it far more. And hindsight is a fantastic thing. If I'd done this mix again, I would have gone back and maybe made some similar changes that he has done. But I'm not doing that. I'm showing you exactly what I've done here. And I've brightened stuff in a similar way, but just in a far less. To me, my mix sounds more processed and his sounds a bit more natural, but he's actually done far more in the way of plugins and processing than I have to achieve that. So I'm not really sure what to make of that. I'm not sure why a processed mix has come from using a bit less processing, but mixing is a weird one. So let's take a look at this piano then. So I've taken out some of the low end just using the channel EQ. You can see that it's just gone there, not affecting anything too much, just taking out the rumble, and then a massive boost in the mid range and going up to the highs. Let's take a listen to it without and then with. That's just helping it cut through a bit. You'll hear why when we listen to the mix. And then here we go. This is where the EQing happens. On the FGS, miles and miles of 9.5 dB of high end there and a load of bottom end as well. Both on the bell. Let's take a listen to it without and then with. Just adding that definition to it once again. Let's take a listen to it without any of that processing in the mix, and then we're going to bring it in and you'll hear exactly why I've made the moves that I have. It just adds that extra layer of intelligibility in the chorus. In particular, that's one element that's just big. It's just massive. It just needs that kind of wall of sound kind of sound. But if we go to the verses, you'll see exactly what it's done. So here's our keys down here. Without that processing, it just means it's actually audible, and it means that it's cutting through in the right area. Although that is kind of the area that the vocal is sitting at as well, because of that instrument bus that I've got, it's just ducking out the way of the vocal. And it's just meaning that adding all that high end to it is making it audible, but not too aggressive. I've not compressed that in any way. I've just added a bunch of high end and added quite a lot of low end as well, just to make that kind of scoop sound just sit in there. And I think it's working well. These strings were an interesting one. Just take a listen to them with the processing on. It's just in that middle kind of crazy section. So take a listen without any of the processing on. And then with. Again, all I'm doing to that is a bit of saturation from the VCC, the SSL channel, and then a bunch of high end because it needed to cut through. With these kind of instruments, you're not necessarily going to need to do an enormous amount to absolutely everything. It's just the points where they come in, you need to allow them to be heard. And this is what it needed. If we take a listen to this section with the EQ engaged, just providing a bed underneath everything. It's just allowing everything else to sit on top of that and creating a little bit of interest in the far left and right. If we take a listen to them on their own, they kind of spread quite wide. And I actually took a listen to these to see if they were in phase with each other, if I needed to phase invert one of them or what it was. I ended up leaving them on their own because to me it sounded like there was a little bit of weirdness in the phase going on, but actually switching some stuff out and making it probably more in phase didn't actually work. So that's an example of if something sounds right, then it probably is right. It might not be technically 100% correct, but if it sounds good in the mix, That's what I'm sticking with, and that's what's always worked for me. So again, relatively little happening there on the keyboards and the strings, but here's the big one. Lee's going to take you through his vocal chain.
So finally, we've gotten to the business end of the mix, the vocals. Let's have a listen to the singer and see what we've done to him. Let's first have a look at the dry verse vocal.
The last time a bird sings we
This is being output to this lead vocal bus just here, which I've done a little bit of processing on. Got a Pro Q2 here. Let's pretend we didn't see this one. Doing a little dip in the mids. You can use any surgical EQ for this. After that, Scheps 73. Let's bring it in. So some subtle shaping. We've got a little boost at 12K, a little bit of extra mid-range in there, and then just the smallest amount of 110 dB. To be fair, I might have just knocked that control by accident. I'm not sure I'm hearing the EQ move there. So that's all that's happening on the bus that all of my lead vocals are ultimately being routed to. So let's have a look at what we got going on in the individual channel. First up is my wild card. We're back with the Irk Sound Soothe 2. Let's have a listen to it. The last time a bird sings we are. I mean, you kind of run out of superlatives to sort of accurately kind of, really capture how good this plugin is. It is so good. Now, I know there are other things on the market that do similar things, but, this is great. I mean, you could get a similar result by chaining a load of dynamic EQs together, but again, that chain would be as long as your arm. This works so transparently. I mean, it's not a sales pitch. It's just a great plugin, and I'm not convinced you can have too much of a good thing, so I've used it again, this time on the invisible de-esser setting. Let's check it out. The last time a bird sings we are but sand. Lessons are a failure of time as a word is a mirror. Lovely. It's doing exactly what I want it to do. De-essing really transparently. All the de-essing I've done pre-compression. What I don't want to be doing is pumping all of those S's into the compressor, because we're just going to raise the level of them. Everything's going to get harsh and difficult to listen to. Speaking of compression, next up we've got the CLA 76. I've used a preset here, male vocal. Let's check out what it's doing. And engage. Sings we are but sand. Lessons are a failure of time as a word is a mirror. So we're probably getting up to somewhere in the region of 7 dB of gain reduction. Attack time, not that quick. Release as fast as it will go. So once we exit this channel, we arrive at this one. This is in series with this vocal channel. So next we're doing a little bit more sculpting with the EQ, Scheps 73 in this case. Let's check it out. The last time a bird sings we are but sand. Lessons are a failure of time as a word is a mirror. So we're adding a little bit of 12K, a little bit of mids, a little bit of thickness in the low end. Next up, we're compressing again. Now, this plugin has been around for donkey's years. It's the Waves RVox. It's really lightweight. It's really easy to use. It sounds transparent. It's hardly got any controls on it. It's almost turned into like a classic plugin in my mind. It just sounds good. Let's have a listen to it. The last time a bird sings we are but sand. Lessons are a failure of time as a word is a mirror. It's keeping that vocal just really nicely pinned, making it sound a little more intimate, a little more in your face. It's great. I think that's all that needs to be said about it. Next up, bit of a new one for me. This is the Scheps Parallel Particles. We've got 4 controls on this. We've got thick, air, bite and sub. You'll notice that I've got the thick wrapped round to almost max. Yes indeed, I am down with the thickness. Let's see what this sounds like.
The last time a bird sings, we are but sand. Lessons are a failure of time, as a word is a mirror. Hold tight, your time will come.
Sounds really good. I think all of the processing on this, as the name implies, is happening in parallel. So the thick control I'm using there, I think is probably adding a bit more compression and possibly some EQ in the low mids as well. I've just manipulated the controls of how I thought they sounded the best, so I've added a little bit of air on the top. And I should note that this is good on all instruments, not just vocals. I've used it on vocals and it sounds good, so no reason not to use it. Last thing in the chain, C1 gate, utility plugin. There's a little bit of noise, as you can see. Let's engage. Noise gone, job's a good one. So what is happening with this vocal now is we've got that's been sort of split to another bus just here. This is running in parallel with the one we just heard. We've got a Scheps 73 EQ. I've taken out quite a bit of the top end. And then I've L2'd it. So, not a great deal of gain reduction going on. This is quite a subtle use of L2. Just controlling the transients a little bit. Let's listen to both of those buses together.
The last time a bird sings, we are but sand.
So that gives you an idea. After that, we've added a nice little bit of seasoning with some effects. Let's have a listen to what we're doing. So the first one is the same delay that we had running on the guitar in the chorus. So it's the dotted quarter note, courtesy of the H delay. Let's have a listen.
The last time a bird sings, we are but sand. Lessons are
the next up, we've got a vocal room. This is being supplied by the Abbey Road Chambers. A lot of controls on this one. I've not had the plugin long enough to kind of work out what they all do, so I've used a preset again. No shame. This one is called Smooth Vocal. Let's see what it's adding.
The last time a bird sings, we are but sand. Lessons are a failure of time, as a word is a mirror. Hold tight.
So quite a vintage flavour to this chamber, but I think that's kind of the idea with the whole Abbey Road bundle. Some really, really nice plugins in that one. Then lastly, we've got a bit of vocal slap delay on here. This one is being supplied courtesy of the Echosphere portion of the CLA Epic plugin. I've used a preset here called Short Slap Room. Let's have a listen to it.
The last time a bird sings, we are but sand. Lessons are a failure of time, as a word is a mirror.
So I'm using it very, very subtly. All I'm trying to do is create a nice little bed for the main vocal to kind of sit in. I think with the delay in there, it just kind of, it's almost like you've got the vocal here and then you've got the delay just here. So that's just sitting on top of it. It almost creates like a little bit of space for the lead vocal on top. Let's listen to all the effects engaged together.
The last time a bird sings, we are but sand.
And in the track. So next we're going to have a look at the chorus vocals. We'll use the end chorus for this one. So the chain is largely unchanged. We've got the 2 soothes to begin with, so we'll instantiate those. And then we've got the first aux running in series. We've got the Scheps 73 again, which EQ is set the same, so we'll put that one on. We've got an Arvox, giving this one a little more compression, so let's have a listen to that.
What if this was your last
Let's bring it in.
Time it seems your biggest weakness. I won't be like that.
Oh, you mad, bro? So, yeah, pegging it a little bit harder on the compression this time. It's the chorus vocal, so I want it to sound a little bit more upfront, a little bit more in your face. After that, we've got the Scheps parallel particles again. Again, settings are basically similar, if not identical, to what we had going on the verse vocal. And then our old friend, the C1 gate, just doing its job quietly in the background. After that, we've got a parallel chain. I think this is the same parallel chains we used on the verse vocal. So we've got the 1073 with the top end removed. And then we've got an L2. Let's see how hard we're hitting that this time.
What if this was your last breath? Time it seems your biggest weakness.
So, you know, just kissing it every now and again, just stopping some of the transients from sort of taking over. So one of the main differences, the chorus vocal, is I've got this aux set up here. Again, this is running in parallel to all the other vocals. Let's have a listen to it. So first thing, we've got a Scheps 73.
What if this was your last
Let's bring it in.
breath? Time it seems your biggest weakness.
Bit of top, bit of mids, bit of low end. In fact, I think it's probably the same vocal EQ I've used throughout. And we've got an L2. Let's see what's going on this one.
What if this was your last breath?
Okay, so
Time it seems your biggest weakness.
So here we are. This is classic L2 territory here. Absolutely annihilating the source. This is brick-walled to God knows where and back. I'm absolutely smashing the life out of this one. You can see on the channel.
What if this was your last breath?
It barely moves. It's absolutely crushed. Smashed. But, however, there is relatively good reason for it. After that, we've got this. This is the Reel ADT from the Abbey Road bundle again. Let's bring it in and see what it's doing.
What if this was your last breath? Time it seems your biggest weakness.
So one of the reasons why I wanted basically zero movement on this vocal, and I wanted it to be just basically, you know, smashing its head against the ceiling, is because I was going to do like a faux double track, and so that's what I've done. And this allows the sort of the sides of the track to kind of come up a little bit more because of all the, you know, the compression on it. So let's check it out with the other vocals, and we'll adjust the blend to taste.
What if this was your last breath? Time it seems your biggest weakness. I won't be like that.
So I'm using it quite subtly. If you use it too much in the track, it can almost make you sound a little bit seasick. So I've been, you know, sort of quite subdued with that one. Other than that, we've got some effects. Now, we've got a long delay. This one is courtesy of a Waves H delay again. This is the dotted half note this time. It's also got the lo-fi engaged. Now, just here you can see this is the automation lane for this delay. I mean, like I said, this is a fantastic vocal performance in this song, and there's not a great deal in the way of backing vocals on it either. We've got this sea shanty kind of barbershoppy kind of thing going on here, but other than that, not a great deal of harmony. So what I've done with this delay is I've attempted to kind of create a sort of counter melody. Let's have a look at it. Let's bring the send out of bypass, and this send is happening on all three of these vocal auxes just here. Let's have a listen.
As your last breath, time it seems your biggest weakness.
So I think it sounds really cool. Let's just engage all the effects and have a listen to that in the track. It's quite nice. I think it adds, nice sort of melodic function in there. Getting back to the vocal on its own, though, next up we've got the same reverb room, courtesy of the Abbey Road reverb. We've got the same slap. But what we've done to this one is we've also added a plate. This was the chorus vocal, so I want it to sound just a touch more epic. The plate is being supplied by Abbey Road reverb plates. Again, loads of controls, preset, no shame, vocal plate, does what it says on the tin, sounds good. Let's bring it in and out and then we can hear what it's doing.
As your last breath, time it seems your biggest weakness. I won't be like that. What if this was you?
So that gives you an idea of what the plate is doing. Again, it's quite low in the mix. None of the vocal effects once the mix are playing, are particularly apparent. Obviously, apart from the delay, which I've been very, very deliberate with. So they're the main vocals. Next up, we've got the barbershop shanty vibe going on down here. Let's have a listen to it.
What was last breath?
Okay, so we've got some low mids to take care of just there. First thing again, use the wildcard again. Once you use it once, it's very difficult to kind of not use it. Let's see what it's doing.
What was last breath? Time seems weakness.
So it's just starting to clear things up a little bit. After that, we've used the Scheps 73, taking out a lot of boxiness in the mid-range on this time.
What was last
Engage.
breath? Time seems weakness.
I say I've taken out a lot of boxiness. I've taken out a lot of everything, as it happens. I've used this EQ in mid-side mode again, similar to how I did on the piano and the mid-late synth. So let's just check out the mid channels on this.
What was last breath? Time
Rolling off at sort of 300 and below. Not adding too much top in the mid channel though. Let's have a listen to the sides. Yeah, so adding a little bit of top. Altogether, the signal sounds a little bit like this.
What was last breath?
Next, I'm adding some compression with the venerable RVox again. Let's bring her in.
What was last breath? Time seems weakness.
So one of the things with this, I do kind of feel like the stereo image on this still kind of feels a bit janky. Like, we've got a couple of voices there, one voice there. I was thinking it kind of sounds a little bit unbalanced. So what we're going to do with it, I've reached for the Reel ADT again. This is what it's doing.
What was last breath? Time seems weakness.
I thank you. What an improvement. Drastically better.
What was last breath?
Let's remove it.
What was last breath? Time seems weakness.
It sounds brilliant. I think that's all we need to say about it. That has done wonders to that vocal. It just sounds so much better now.
What was last breath? Time seems.
No longer does it sound like we've got, individual voices kind of sat out like, in the sides. It just sounds like we've got this nice overall wash of vocals.
What was last breath?
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, and I've added a little bit of reverb plate to that, same one that we've got on the snare. So last but not least, we've got one BV in the second verse. Here it is.
Bearable man.
A little bit of reverb on there, let's kill that.
Bearable man.
So a definite resonance in the low end there. This is where we can use a little bit more soothe. Let's bring it in.
Bearable man. Bearable man.
And let's take it off as the track's playing.
Bearable man.
I think once you remove it, you can really hear what it's doing. Fantastic. Fantastic plugin. Next, we've got Scheps 73, adding some top, removing some mids. That's about it. High passing at 300, just to remove some of the low end. We don't want it stamping all over the main vocal. Let's have a listen.
Bearable man.
Then, a little bit of compression. Same vocal compression settings as I used on the verse and chorus vocals. Let's have a listen.
Bearable man.
Let's remove the soothe now and see what it's doing.
Bearable man.
Not quite as bad once it gets compressed, but obviously it's probably best to fix these kind of things at source.
Bearable man.
Definitely tidies it up a lot. And then a little bit of token plate on the reverb.
Bearable man.
So, by and large, that concludes the mix pretty much. However, there is one more thing that we need to take a look at. Now, I have gratuitously stolen this one from Andrew Scheps. Just here next to my master bus, I've got a rear bus. Now, all of the outputs that would typically be going to my main output, just here, are being sent to submix, which is the whole mix. So if I mute this, we've got nothing other than, strangely, a little bit of, oh, there we go. There. Let's change that. That rogue piano chorus there. So all of the mix is going through the submix, and what I'm doing essentially is parallel compressing the whole mix apart from the drums. Let's have a listen. So I'm just using an 1176. Usually I think you're supposed to use a 2-to-1 ratio on this, but I don't have an 1176 which got the 2-to-1 ratio on it, and I've just used some attack and release settings that seem, kind of about right. Now what we're doing essentially is just blending this up underneath the mix. Let's listen to it with and without. So it feels like it's adding a bit of fatness. Of course, we're getting a level increase as well, and as we know, louder is always better. But I think the compression on there just kind of helps to, thicken it out a little bit. We're not exactly adding, the same thing on top of itself. We are kind of calming the transients down a little bit, which is going to effectively kind of give us kind of more fatness.
So to cap it all off, we've got my vocals then. I've approached this in a relatively similar way to Lee with the reverb and the delay. He's got a bit more fancy stuff going on than I have, but let's check it out. And there are two kind of distinct sections in this song. So we've got the chorus, which is a far more belted vocal, a far bigger vocal, and then we've got the other vocal, which happens in the verse. Let's take a look at the chorus vocal to start off with, just on its own. Let's solo it and see what we've got going on.
What if this was your last breath? time it seems your biggest weakness, but I won't be like that. Oh.
Okay, so other than the effects and like, the reverb and delay, basically what I've got going on here is I've taken out some of the low end, the real rumble, below 85 hertz. That's just as a matter of course. And then a fantastic de-esser that I actually really like is the Eiosis, whichever one it is, that came with all the Slate Digital stuff. And it's just quite intuitive. It just allows you to be really like set and forget about it. I've put it on a solo vocal and then just toyed around with the sensitivity and the amount. There's just a few S's in there that were kind of getting my back up a little bit. Let's hear it without and then with. You can actually see that these are the S's, the ones that are the kind of yellowy orange brown colour.
What if this was your last breath?
Could you hear those?
What if this was your last?
This was, and then with the de-esser engaged.
What if this was your last breath?
So crucially, it's not killing them completely. I didn't want to do that. It's just getting rid of them the right amount so they're not poking out the mix. And crucially, I've got this happening before any of my dynamic processing, any of the extra EQing or compression or anything like that. I want to kill them before it goes into that. I don't want to add a load of high-end EQ and then have to get rid of that using the de-esser. There is space for that in certain techniques, but for this is what we're doing. So overall, it's going through the Neve channel. I like that. It added a little bit of crunch to it that I really liked. And then just a small amount of EQ. Again, I feel like I've been really hesitant with my EQ moves across this whole mix. But on reflection, I think that hesitancy is a reflection of it being a really good recording. Had it been recorded in a way that's not sounding as good as this does, then I might have had to be heavier handed. But for this, I've just had to make subtle moves, other than the toms, which were pretty crazy. So I've just added a small amount of high end, and then I am crushing this with the vocal compressor here, the FG Stress. Take a listen before and after.
What if this was your last breath? Time it seems your biggest weakness, but I won't be like that.
So with those falsetto bits, they're normally the bit that you have to bring up, but he's actually been really consistent with these. It's just leveling the whole thing out. It's not adding a massive amount of coloration. It's on that 4:1 setting again that I love, and I'm just bringing the input and output up and down together and then tailoring my attack and release. Nothing crazy going on there, just a standard vocal leveling compressor. That's all there is to it. Now, I initially felt that I was going to have to automate this like crazy. And in fact, if you look at the automation lanes across the entire mix, there's such a small amount actually happening. I'm bringing up that parallel drum mix in the choruses, bringing it down in the verses, same with the room in certain areas. But overall, automation-wise, I'm not really doing a hell of a lot. The automation is kind of the icing on the cake for me, and I didn't have to do too much because the whole thing was so dynamic and it sounded so great as it was. The arrangement had really excelled in that area, so it wasn't as if I had to say, right, this verse sounds exactly the same as the chorus. How on earth am I going to bring this chorus up? They'd already done that with the arrangement, and if you've got a great arrangement, if you've got a great recording, then the mix is so simple to do. That's just 101 of mixing. But to these vocals, I think that the actual overall delayed and reverbed sound that I had, it stayed relatively similar. So in the actual verse sections, it was more apparent because there were fewer instruments in there, but it's the same sound essentially. Just take a listen.
Failure of time as a word is never. Hold tight, your time will come. How did life pass by?
You can just hear more of it because there are fewer instruments there. But the reverb is from Verbsuite Classics again, and this is the Vocal Heaven preset, and I've not touched this. I've just put it on and thought, wow, that sounds amazing. It's 1.8 second delay, which is normally a little bit big for me, but I think with the verses being as sparse as they were, it needed a little bit of something to fill it out. And then in the choruses, when everything comes in, it can kind of be as big as it wants because everything else is just filling that space. So that reverb is just as it is. Let's take a listen to just the reverb. Just adding that extra sheen on top with the high end there and a little bit of a boost in the mid range. And then the delay is one that I do as a matter of course really. This is repeater, and this is always going to be on the CLA-ish 8th note delay, just synced to the tempo of a track. That's the only vocal delay I ever really use, I ever really need, unless I'm doing something mad with delay throws or whatever, as Lee has done. But to me, that's all I need. Let's take a listen to just the vocal delay without the actual vocal. Just that kind of flickering. And it just adds a certain element in the actual mix. If we take a listen to the track without any of the vocal effects at all, the vocal just kind of dies a little bit. Let's take those out. Just adds that extra dimension. That's all I'm doing with my effects. The whole way along, I've really thought about what I wanted to do with my effects. I've not used anything just for the sake of using it. I've put it on because I thought it needed to be there. In that section, it needed a reverb and a delay to fill out those sections. And the Slate Digital ones are fantastic. Repeater is a great delay. And then Verbsuite Classics, we all know what a fantastic reverb plugin that is. And another one that I've basically done nothing to is in the chorus we have this this gang vocal, I guess you'd call it, like the harmonies. Take a listen.
What was last breath? Time seems weakness.
Which really fills out the whole thing when you get the lead vocal in there.
Yes, but I won't be like that. Oh.
And it's beautiful. It sounds great. All I've done to that, I've done nothing on the channel level. If you see, no plugins here, no plugins there. All that's going on is on the bus. I've got everything going to the reverb and delay again. Quite hot there. There's quite a lot going in. And then on this, I've taken out all the bottom end, which is coming up to around 120, 130 hertz. And then this one here is just the side EQ. I've got it all panned, and it's just bringing up a little bit of the sound surrounding. It's not an immediate kind of SE top end. It's not doing that at all. It's just bringing up the stuff in the far left and right speaker. Take a listen to it, without and then with.
What was last breath? Time seems weakness. I won't be like that.
It's just a small touch that is just adding an extra element in the far left and right, a little bit of interest, and just a little bit of, I don't know what you call it, just that kind of the sprinkling on top that just makes a great vocal performance even better. So for the last time then, for my mix, let's hear everything all together in that great chorus.
What if this was your last breath? Time it seems your biggest weakness, but I won't be like that.
Thanks so much for checking it out. I hope that's been as useful for you as it genuinely has been for me. Seeing how someone else approaches a mix that I've been working on is really illuminating, and just goes to show how sometimes you think you're making the right moves, but then someone else is making completely different moves and getting an even better sound. And it kind of makes you reassess what you're doing and looking at different ways of doing stuff. As we've been saying all the way through, it is so much about the ears here. It's so much about how you're hearing what you're mixing and how you're then applying that using the tools that you've got. Yes, we were shooting out Slate Digital plugins versus Waves plugins, but to me, this was really my ears versus Lee's ears. How does he hear stuff, and then how does he approach that with the tools that he has? And how can I compare that to the way that I work? Thanks so much for checking it out. I'll see you again soon. Take care.